Welcome everybody to the 26th in our Middle Eastern history series, the Albanian Köprülü Viziers and the Ottoman economy. And for those who are familiar, please give me a few seconds while I lay out the rules. The first thing is that this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the subjects that we're going to be discussing, and I will try to present it from a secular point of view. Right, but at the end of the day, I'm just a layperson who really likes this kind of history and these kinds of subjects, and I'm happy to bring it to you. Additionally, I would like to invoke Will Wheaton's law of don't be a dick, right? If you have, these are sensitive topics, especially when we get to the subject of the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E. So please be respectful. And that said, I love interactivity. Please put your questions, comments, clarifications in the chat or raise your hand. I do read the chat. I will read your comments and respond to them as time permits. And this class will be a 101 and a 201, by which I mean that if you already know something about this period, I'll tell you more than you already did. But if you don't worry, I'll catch you up. And this class is a 2-hour hard stop, which means that at the end of 2 hours, no matter how far we get, that's the last slide we're going to see. There may be some more questions, some more time to tie things up, but any slides that are left over, we'll just go to next week. So you don't have to worry about missing anything in the lecture series. And finally, this is a recording like all of the episodes before, and you can watch the entire slideshow. All right. All right, so the quiz to see what everybody remembers from last week. So question number 1, which of the following best explains why the harem had so much control over policy during the Sultanate of Women? Is it A, one of Suleiman I's reforms was to give women representation on the divan as the nişancı, and it was women from the harem who usually occupied this role? B, many of the sultans in this period were either incompetent or uninterested in governance, giving the Valide Sultan and the Haseki Sultan the opening for power? Is it C, the Grand Vizier worked to empower the Valide Sultans in order to establish themselves as a key power in this period? Or is it D, the provincial bureaucracy led by the Qadis reported directly to the Haseki Sultan, making her the central point of information in Constantinople? And I have 2 people guessing B. B is absolutely the right answer. The other ones are just false. The nişancı was the court scribe and transcriptionist. That role was usually a male role. The Grand Viziers during this period were relatively weak, other than Köprülü Mehmet Paşa, and their power actually came from the women in the harem supporting them, and the Qadis did not report to the Haseki Sultan. All right, question number 2. Which of the following battles took place during the reign of Sultan Selim II, who reigned from 1566 to 1574? Choose all that apply. The Siege of Eger, the Siege of Astrakhan, the Conquest of Cyprus, the Battle of Yerevan, the Battle of Lepanto, the Battle of Khotin, and the Conquest of Tunis. I've got people guessing A and C, A and E alone. Well, E is a right answer and C is a right answer, but A is not a right answer. Eger happened during the reign of Mehmet III. Any other guesses? F. F was during the reign of Osman II. So basically it's B, right? The Siege of Astrakhan that happened during the reign of Selim II, the Conquest of Cyprus, happened during his reign. The Battle of Yerevan happened during the reign of Murad III. And also a different Battle of Yerevan happened during the reign of Murad IV, but none of them happened during Selim II. Battle of Lepanto was during Selim II, Battle of Khotin, Osman II, and Conquest of Tunisia, Selim II. So B, C, and E and G. All right. Question number 3. Which of the following best describes Nur Banu Sultan's role as the Valide Sultan of Murad III? She was effective in distracting her son by pleasing his sexual appetites and conspired with the Grand Viziers to effectively be the absolute monarch until her death in 1583. She was accommodating and supportive and encouraging others to give their input in the court, especially of Murad III's Haseki Sultan Safia, with whom she did charitable works. She retreated to the Kafes to be with her other children, since being intimately involved in the court was very taxing for such an unintelligent woman. She began a long love affair with Grand Vizier Soglu Mehmet Pasha and convinced him to revolt against the Ottoman state with her as his queen, and the revolt failed. And I've got one answer in the chat. The answer is A. Correct answer. She was effective in distracting her son by pleasing his sexual appetites and conspired with the Grand Viziers to effectively be the absolute monarch until her death in 1583. That's exactly what happened. B is false. She actually had the biggest court conflict with Haseki Sultan Safia because they were both competing for Murad III's attention. And when Safia had entranced Murad III to take her as his wife, it gave Nurbanu less ability to control him through his second head. She did not go into the Kafes. She was an incredibly intelligent woman and saw no need to escape the world. She was very interested in that. And she was never in love with Soglu Mehmet Pasha. She and he were good allies in the court, but there was no love between those two individuals. And Soglu Mehmet Pasha never revolted. While I have a question asking if Nurbanu and Safia did charitable works together. They both did charitable works. They founded a number of mosques and medreses, which are Islamic schools, imaret, which are soup kitchens, and a number of other buildings like these throughout the empire. But at no point did they do these things together. They didn't work together to achieve them. All right, number 4. Which of the following were Ottomans' enemies during the Sultanate of Women? Choose all that apply. All right, let's see. E. E is correct. Habsburg Austria was definitely an enemy. A is also correct. The Republic of Venice was an enemy. G was an enemy. Yeah, they fought the Safavids in Persia. Who else? H. Yeah, Tsarist Russia competed with them over Astrakhan. C. Saadi and Morocco. Actually, at this point, Saadi and Morocco was more of a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. For example, a little bit during the reign of Murad III, but otherwise they were relatively neutral. E. Habsburg Austria again. Yep, that's a great answer. But we forgot B, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? That Battle of Khotyn between Osman II and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Khanates of Crimea and Nogai were allies of the Ottomans, so they were not an enemy. The Hafsids in Tunisia were an enemy, which is why the Ottomans overthrew them and established the Eyalet, or province of Tunisia. And the rest we talked about, the Safavids and the Tsarists were opposed. So it's A, B, E, F, G, and H. All right. And the final question number 5. Which of the following best describes what happened during the Ottoman-Safavid Wars between 1579 and 1639? Is it A, Kusim Sultan and Deli Mustafa were caught off guard and lost significant Caucasus territories to the Persians? Quick action by Osman II at the Battle of Ditgori led to peace. B, Grand Vizier Soglu Mehmet Pasha argued for restraint where the Persians were concerned, but the Janissaries refused and were slaughtered in Yerevan by Persian artillery. The failure led to the Janissary Corps being retired for Sipahi. C, the war was primarily naval, with the Ottoman fleet engaging the Portuguese fleet in the Strait of Hormuz, and Safavid cannons assisting from Bandar Abbas. Or D, the Ottomans took advantage of internal feuding in the Safavid Persia to make early territorial gains, but Shah Abbas reversed those gains and then some, only to have Sultan Murad IV win at Baghdad and sign the Treaty of Zuhab, which mirrored the former Treaty of Amasya. Any guesses? All right. Oh, we do have one guess. Let's see. The guess is B. No, unfortunately, no. The answer is D. The Ottomans took advantage of internal feuding in Safavid Persia to make early territorial gains, and the rest of it. A is incorrect. None of those things happened. B, Köprülü Mehmet Pasha was actually in favor of an invasion of Persia. And the Janissaries were actually quite effective in Yerevan. The war was primarily overland, so C is false. And yeah, and D is the only one that's correct. All right. So now, last time we left towards the end of Suleiman's reign and then the Sultanate of Women. So the empire is basically at its largest extent, with the exception of that little blue area in the north that we're going to address a little later, close to Kiev. With the exception of that territory, all of these territories are under the Ottoman control by the end of the Sultanate of Women. And so we have a large empire that's spanning three continents, and is incredibly numerous in the quantity of people it possesses, right? We have people from Southern Europe, we have people from Northern Africa, people from the Middle East, all of these widely different territories under the Turkish government. And we spoke last time about this Sultanate of Women, right? That there were these women in the court. They were primarily women from the Balkans, right? We can see from their ethnicities, they're either from the Caucasus region, like Georgians or Circassians, or they're from the Balkans, Bosnians, Greeks, Serbs, Russians, Ukrainians, Ruthenians, Poles, Hungarians, all of these people who are being brought in through the devshirme system, right? The daughters of devshirme, or they were kidnapped. They were taken while walking by the seaside. There's a pirate raid, and they're captured by Ottoman slavers. That, for example, was the story of Köse, right? She was originally a Greek woman who was kidnapped by sailors. So you have both of these sort of entry points. Now, we also discussed that the role of the Sultan had become significantly reduced since Suleiman left the Sultanate. And the Sultan was primarily involved with religious duties, staying in Topkapi Palace, while the arrangements of what was going to happen was led by that Council of Military and Political Affairs, made of numerous ministers. We also discussed that the way that these ministers met led to a number of the women in the harem spying on them, and therefore being able to affect the position of the ruler. And we had the Grand Vizier as almost a toy, with the exception of Köprülü Mehmet Pasha. Most of the Grand Viziers were relatively weak and in the control of sort of the harem political dynamics with the divan. Towards the end, right, we have this Treaty of Zuhab between Sultan Murad IV and the Safavid Persians, and that really calms down the border in the east for nearly 100 years. There would be some action in the 1720s, but by and large, the Persians were much more concerned with maintaining their own country after the defeat in 1639 than they were in expanding towards the Ottoman Empire. And the Treaty of Zuhab, its borders are actually very familiar to us today. The border between Iraq and Iran that exists today more or less follows the Treaty of Zuhab, as well as the border between Turkey and Iran today. So last time we left with Mehmet IV just becoming Sultan, and he is a relatively weak ruler. He's also relatively young when he becomes Sultan. And so it's in the hand of his mother, Turhan, how the country will be run. Now, I sort of wanted to take a little bit of a step back from some of the stuff that we've been doing, because we've been spending a lot of time on the politics and organization in Istanbul. And I think that it's very important for us also to understand what was it like in the rest of the provinces? What was it like to be an Ottoman subject? What was the world that the Ottomans were living in? What was going on there? So the first thing that I want to sort of take apart is how the Ottoman system was actually organized from a administrative and bureaucratic perspective. If you look closely at this map, you'll see that there are areas that are dark green. There are areas that are sort of moderate green. There are areas that are a very, very pale green, and there are areas that are purple. And these represent different governing styles in different areas of the Ottoman Empire. The areas that are dark green are what are called the eyalets, or provinces. And for example, Rumelia, which is modern Bulgaria, parts of northern Greece, North Macedonia, that's the eyelet of Rumelia. Anatolia is also an eyelet. Egypt is an eyelet. Many of these areas, these are directly governed provinces that are being ruled by somebody educated in Constantinople, sent to those provinces to govern them. Either this person is a son of Devshirme, or a qualified professional who has gone to the schools in Istanbul to be educated in this way, and they run those provinces. The ones that are either in the medium green or the purple, those represent autonomous regions. So these are regions that are under the suzerainty and of the Ottoman Empire, are technically part of the Ottoman Empire. The soldiers of the Ottoman Empire can freely enter and leave. But it's worth pointing out that these areas will often have their own rulers, their own styles of government. And we're going to sort of see a little bit of that as we go through. And the countries that are in that pale green, like Wallachia or the Nogai or Kathiri in Yemen, or the Funj or the Funj Sultanate in what's now Sudan, these are independent countries that are vassals of the Ottoman Empire, tributaries of the Ottoman Empire. And so they don't enforce Ottoman law, but they are required to provide tribute and can be called upon in times of war to provide soldiers. So when it comes to the way that these secondary states, these tributary vassal states will pay their tribute, you have a number of different things coming from different vassal states. So Wallachia and Moldavia are two of the states that compose modern Romania, the third being Transylvania and Hungary. All three of these, Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania and Hungary, are vassal states of the Ottoman Empire. But specifically, Wallachia and Moldavia are the ones pushing out wheat, and the Ottoman Empire had a wheat demand from these two regions, specifically because Constantinople, as you can imagine, from being a large city, required numerous amounts of grain for the daily bakeries. And given Romania's position relatively close to Constantinople on the Black Sea and its ability to grow vast amounts of grain, that was the way that the Ottoman Empire decided that Wallachia and Moldavia should pay their tribute, because that was the most useful to the Sultan. There were other states that paid tribute differently. The Crimean Khanate and the Grand Nogai Horde were both vassal states of the Ottoman Empire, and the way that they paid their tribute was in slaves. So you had the Crimean port of Kaffa, which you can see on that map. It's actually very close to Balchisaray on that map, sort of on the Crimean Peninsula. And that port of Kaffa was responsible for a significant percentage of the white slaves in the Ottoman Empire. We're going to discuss that a little bit more in depth when we talk about the economy in greater detail. So we also have to sort of realize that once we exclude the vassal states from our discussion and we get to those territories that are either eyalets, provinces, or are autonomous regions that are still under the Ottoman control, there are 5 different types of land. Now, these 5 types of land are more thoroughly broken down in the Tanzimat reforms in 1858. But in this period, we have a number of different land groups that would be solidified in that reform. It's just that they don't have an exact legal name, but they're still in operation. And these are the 5 types. We start with Arazi Miri. And Arazi just means lands in Ottoman Turkish. Arazi Miri are the lands of the king, the royal prerogative lands. And that pretty much counts for over 70% of the total land area of the Ottoman Empire. It was considered that the king had the right to all of the natural resources of the Ottoman Empire, the mines, the forests, the vast tracts of land, the deserts, everything. And the Ottoman Sultan could give of this land as he wished, either for use or for ownership, but it was the Sultan's to do with as he pleased. After that, there was the Arazi Mamluk, and Mamluk means owned. So Arazi Mamluk is land owned in fee simple, for those of you who are lawyers. For those of you who are not lawyers, it means that a private citizen actually has possession of the land in a functional sense. So Arazi Mamluk could be bought, sold, exchanged between private citizens, as you would expect. You have Arazi Mavkuf, and Arazi Mavkuf, okay. Arazi Mavkuf is land that is put aside as Vakf, a Vakif in Turkish, Waqf in Arabic, which is a land trust. We'll talk a little bit about how that works and what that is and why that would happen. But the only land that could be put into Mevkuf had to previously be Mamluk, which is why the arrows go in the direction they do. You then have Arazi Metruk, which is shared or organized land. And Arazi Metruk refers to parts of land that no longer are in the purview of the Sultan because they have some kind of construction upon them. But at the same time, they are shared between common people. These could be things like roads or a threshing barn that numerous farmers will use at once. So nobody actually owns it, but in the same way, the Sultan doesn't own it, but in the same way, it can't be transferred via fee simple. It's not an owned property. It's not a memluk because it's not owned by any specific private citizen. And the last kind of land was what was called Arazi Mavet, or the dead lands. And Arazi Mavet refers to any land in the Ottoman Empire that is no longer used for cultivation, even though it may have originally been part of Arazi Metruk, Arazi Mafkuf, or Arazi Mamluk. And so once the land was dead, it could revert to becoming Arazi Miri. It could revert to becoming land owned and controlled by the Sultan. I have a question of, is the mi prefix significant? This is an Arabic grammatical construction in most of the cases. In Mavet, it's not. But in Memluk, Mevkuf, and Metruk, this is the way in Arabic you create a passive participle. So in English, for example, if you want to turn a verb into an adjective, you use the passive participle, right? This is a colored book. This is a possessed home. This is a empowered woman, right? Like you take a verb and you put it in this passive participle form and you turn it into an adjective. In Arabic, me'u is how you do it. And since these words are Turkish words, the Turkish originally takes from the Persian takes originally from the Arabic grammatical construction is what's relevant here. So, right, malaka in Arabic is to own, memluk is owned. Vakf in Arabic is land is trust or land trust. Mevkuf put into a land trust, right? So that's where the me'u is coming from. Mavet just means dead, and miri is a Turkish word meaning royal. So the majority of people were living on lands that they did not own, right? Arazi Mamluk was a portion of private property, but most people who lived on land that was still Arazi Midi. It was given over to peasants or to Timars. We're going to discuss Timars in just a second for use, but it was not given over to them for cultivation. Sorry, for ownership. They could use the land, but not own it. And you can see sort of on the left-hand side what an Ottoman property deed would look like towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. But in the earlier part of the Ottoman Empire, they were less standardized than you see here. But you can see it delineates the price, the usage, the dimensions, the office that was permitting it, as well as the tughra, meaning the signature of the royal certificate that would allow this the possession of land to occur. Now, in terms of the way that most people were living in the Ottoman Empire was a highly rural state. We're talking less than 10% of people lived in cities. Most people lived in small villages with little industrialization. It was a primarily pastoral and agricultural economy. And to the extent that you had developments in cities, you had things like artisans. Almost never was it the case that you had a large-scale production or industrial factory. This will eventually start to come to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. We'll talk about that. But by and large, the Ottoman economy, especially in the 1600s, when we're talking about, is very, very underdeveloped. And one of the things that we see is that almost all trade is local trade. There is international trade, and we will cover that. But 80% of the Ottoman economy was local trade, people trading within less than 100 miles from their house and consuming goods across that distance. We're talking about food, artisanry, wood carving, hoes and other agricultural equipment, things that were made locally and used locally. We also talked about the Timars. Now, the Timars were given, as we pointed out earlier, to Turkish nobility, so that way they could create wealth from the land. But now the Timars that were given primarily as what was called usufruct. Now, this means that they're allowed to benefit from the land, right? If there's trees, they're allowed to cut them and sell the wood. If there's coal, as was very common also in Bulgaria, which was the center of where a lot of these Timars were distributed, they could extract the coal and sell it, but they never actually gained the right to own the land, right? They had the right of usufruct, but not the right of ownership. In Turkish, we call this tasarruf and raqaba. Again, these are terms that were taken from Persian from Arabic. So you have this right to use the land to your benefit, but you don't actually own it, which creates problems if the Sultan chooses to redistribute the land, which, of course, since it is the Sultan's land, the Sultan owns that land. You don't have the ability to contest this. As I pointed out, the Turkish nobles, or Ghazi, who were these leading warriors, were the ones who were granted the Timars. And the areas that they were granted the Timars in were actually very specific. They were generally granted Timars in what is the Eyalet of Rumelia, or in the western part of Anatolia, into some of the northern parts of the Middle East, like Aleppo or Mosul. But the majority of the Ottoman Empire, in terms of land area, was not divided into Timars. And Turkish nobility were not given power there, primarily because of whatever local arrangements the Ottoman Empire was maintaining for power. There's a question as to whether the Timariot, the people who own Timars, if they pay rent. They do pay a certain rent to the Sultan, but it's actually quite nominal. The real wage, we could say, that the Timariot pays to the Sultan is that he is responsible for making sure that there is a cavalry division when the Sultan calls up troops for battle, right? All these Timariot were themselves originally Sipahi. You can see a Sipahi in the lower right-hand side. These horse, these medium cavalry, medium to light cavalry. And so you had a situation where the Sultan would go to war. He would call all the Timariots to bring out Sipahi divisions, and that was their way of paying for the Timar. Now, I have another question as to whether farm ownership could pass from father to child. The usufruct passes. The right of ownership does not pass. So you have to hope that the Sultan will hold on to and continue to allow the same Timariot family to use this same piece of land, right? The Sultan can at any time and at his full and without any judicial recourse can take this land from the Timariots. Now, this doesn't happen very often, but it can happen, right? This is just, they only have the right to profit from the land, not the right to own the land. And it's pretty significant that Rumelia, especially under these Timariots, is responsible for 25% of all revenues generated within the Ottoman Empire, which is highly disproportionate for how small amount of land it is. And it comes from a number of different things. There's timber and mines that are there's timber that's exported from the great forests of Bulgaria. There are mines throughout Bulgaria and northern Greece that produce all kinds of metals and coal. There is a certain amount of production. When we talk about production at this point in time, we're talking about artisanry that's based in Rumelia. You also have land taxes, which are paid by those who own land directly, those areas that are Memluk, Arazi Memluk. And there are the poll taxes. Remember that non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire pay a poll tax, and the Balkans region, including Rumelia, but not just Rumelia, the Balkans region is still majority Christian. And so you have large numbers of Christians paying this tax, which is helping to build up the Ottoman coffers. Now, we've talked about this Arazi Mevkuf, or Waqf, Waqf or Waqf, which is a land trust, and it's a little difficult to understand sort of as a basic idea, but what the Waqif or founder of the trust will do is that he puts aside land into this trust, and the usufruct of that land, right, the value that can be expropriated from that land, has to go to charitable causes, either supporting a mosque or supporting an Islamic school. And so you have the Mawquf, the Waqf asset, which is generating this usufruct, and you have the beneficiaries, the Mawquf ilayh, the people who receive the benefit, right? That would be the students in the school or the patrons of the mosque. And you have the sa'iqa, or the expression, meaning the legal codice in which the waqf would be written. Now, the benefit of the waqf is that a waqf is eternal. It cannot be alienated from the moment it has been put into existence, which meant that a number of Timariots decided, especially when it looked more and more likely that the Sultan was going to redistribute the Timars, they would put their Timar into land Arazi Mevkuf. They would make it a Waqf. And they would do that specifically because the Waqf could never be alienated from them, right? Now, they lost a significant portion of their wealth doing this, in the sense of now all of the profits from the land would need to go to those charitable institutions, save whatever they needed to survive on. But it meant that it could never be alienated from them, which is something that was highly desirable. This was especially the case in the 1600s, because in the 1600s, you had lots of Spanish gold flooding the market. And when I say Spanish gold, I mean the gold that the Spaniards stole from the Native Americans, especially in South America. But that gold had a huge effect on the economic situation, especially in the Ottoman Empire, but not exclusively. It also had a huge effect in Europe overall. But the Ottoman Empire was never able to create a currency which had any strong international appeal. And so you had the akçe. You can see an akçe in the middle of the screen, that sort of silver coin. And the akçe was the Ottoman specie, was the Ottoman coin of choice. And each timar was worth a certain amount of akçe, usually around 50,000 akçe. But the thing is that the value of the akçe to the Venetian ducat, which was sort of the currency that everybody used to compare against, same way that people will use the dollar or euro to compare against other currencies today. When the akçe was first measured against the ducat in the mid 1400s, it was roughly 60 akçe to the ducat. By the end of the 1500s, it was over 400 akçe to the ducat. So massive amounts of inflation. The value of these timars plummeted because the timars were still denominated in akçe as opposed to being denominated in ducats or any kind of foreign currency like the Habsburg thaler, which were more stable. And so a lot of timariots also put their land into vakf because that way its lack of monetary worth was no longer an issue towards maintaining it and paying the taxes on it. I have a question of, was there any theoretical religious grace attached to founding a waqf? Absolutely, right? A waqf is part of Islamic religious belief that you should give charity and that you should provide for the needy in the community. And so those who gave mokuf, gave waqf assets and secured them as land trusts were generally seen more positively than otherwise. So there was also this religious benefit. But in terms of the people that were doing this, we're not seeing this, for example, coming primarily out of the most religious timariots. We're seeing this as much more of an equivalent to a Western trust or an equivalent to Western estate planning than we see it as a religious piece, although it certainly does have that value. We also see that the interaction with the New World, although the interaction is always secondary, right? The Ottomans are not arriving in their ships in the New World. That's not what's happening. In fact, most of the colonizers, the Spaniards especially, forbade Muslims from entering their ports. That said, these crops made their way to the Ottoman Empire. Maize was particularly significant in the Balkans region. Even today in Romania, there's a very famous kind of polenta called mamaliga, which is made of maize. Crushed maize was also used throughout the Middle East, especially to feed animals. You also had wide-scale cultivation of tobacco throughout the Middle East, and you had the beginning of the smoking hookah culture. This is when it starts to develop. Because, of course, prior to the introduction of tobacco from the New World, that obviously can't exist. And finally, we have the introduction of coffee. Coffee is not a New World crop. Coffee comes from Ethiopia, and it had made its way to Yemen. Especially, the Ottomans encountered it, especially at the port of Mocha, which is where the term mocha comes from in English. It's believed that coffee spread to Western Europe when after the second siege of Vienna in 1683, that the Ottoman camp was discovered there with all this coffee, and the Venetians tried it and liked it. Of course, Italians were drinking coffee even as early as the late 1400s. All of it, of course, coming from the Ottoman Empire, which had brought it from Yemen to Constantinople. So it was part of the Mediterranean milieu. So we also have to sort of we've talked about sort of the agricultural economy, and that's a significant portion, probably the majority of Ottomans, especially if we're talking about Ottomans in southern Europe and Anatolia. But we also have a large nomadic population. This may be as much as 15% of the total population in those regions is nomadic. And a number of them are Turkic tribes. You also have a number of nomadic tribes in the Arab world, especially the Bedouin, right? The desert people. Bedouin literally means desert people. And so you have these sort of markets that you develop where the pastoralists bring their milk and their meat, which they produce in far greater quantities than the sedentary people. And in turn, they buy from the sedentary people all kinds of artisanal works, bread, and other things that can be grown. And so there's this trade that develops within the Ottoman Empire in these sort of microeconomies between local pastoral nomadic people and people who are sedentary. Of course, those nomadic people become one of the chief recruitment areas for the Sekban. We've talked about Sekban before. Those are those irregular infantry. And sometimes when they get laid off because a war ends, they become very hostile to the Ottoman government. And so they'll turn on their sedentary neighbors as a way of forcing the Ottoman government to come to terms with them in terms of payment. The Bedouin, especially the Bedouin close to Mecca, were very well compensated for keeping travelers safe during the Hajj. And so we see far fewer revolts among the Bedouin than we do among the pastoralists in Anatolia, where we have all these Jalali revolts. There's actually a funny anecdote that they were building the railway in the 19th century from Constantinople to Mecca with the point of bringing people to Mecca for the Hajj or religious pilgrimage. But the Sharif of Mecca, who was one of these autonomous Bedouin leaders, refused to allow the trains to pass through his territory because that would cut into the wealth that he was able to derive from guaranteeing security across the desert. So the train went to Medina, but it never went to Mecca. Because the Sultan wanted to make sure that he respected the autonomy of the Sharif of Mecca. All right. So when it comes to trade, there were a few other notes that I wanted to make. The first one is that we really don't see capital formation in the Ottoman Empire. That's not the way that business happens. We don't have a large aggregation of wealth into industrial or large-scale production facilities. All production within the Ottoman Empire remains relatively small and individualistic. And to the degree that that is local, it's happening in caravanserais, which are these grand hotels that the traders will stop in on their way from city to city. And of course, the central markets in the town, usually these are located near to a mosque. Another thing that we want to keep into account is that cities do not produce that which sustains them. So, right, if for those of you who live near a major city, especially if that city is on water like New York or Constantinople is, you see numerous barges and ships coming into port with the food every single day to make sure that the large size of that city can be sustained. And so Constantinople is entirely indebted to the Balkans and to Anatolia for the foodstuffs that keep coming in day after day to keep the city sustained. We also see the development of commercial banking houses. Most of these are run by Christians and Jews, a number of them run by foreign corporations, especially as we move into the later centuries. Because of Muslim prohibitions on usury that are very similar to the ones that you may be more familiar with as in Christianity or Judaism, Muslims were effectively forbidden from going into banking. There was no actual legal requirement that they not, but it was much more acceptable for the Jews and the Christians to do so. Now, the Janissaries were also forbidden from directly engaging in the economy. Their only loyalty was supposed to be to the Sultan, and accordingly, um, and accordingly, they were not allowed to derive economic wealth from anything else. That was actually the issue, right? That Osman II tried to stop the Janissaries from doing, which is why the Janissaries killed him. The Janissaries were running coffee houses, making lots of money at it, and didn't want to be stopped by a sultan. But accordingly, even though Janissaries did make some money on these enterprises, far more of their money came from extortion and other protection rackets against the guilds and other agricultural groups, so they could continue to make money on the side. I have a question about the spice trade. And as you can see, I have a slide to talk about that, so we'll get there. I have a question as to why Muslims were not doing banking. There are Quranic verses against usury, similarly to how there are biblical verses against usury. And so it was very difficult for a Muslim to charge interest on a loan, and without interest, the entire facade of modern banking doesn't work. Now, there is an attempt in the 20th century to create Islamic banking, and it requires a lot of mechanisms and legal fictions. Not to say that there aren't legal fictions in Western economics as well, but these legal fictions are much more involved and complicated in Islamic banking. They require, for example, mutual buy-ins, shareholding between the parties. You can't have an at-distance relationship where interest sort of covers the lack of proximity as you do in Western banking. So by and large, Muslims couldn't square Islam with banking, and those who would be more inclined to do so were nonetheless part of the Muslim society responsible to the Shaykh al-Islam, and therefore their rights in terms of banking were curtailed. All right. Now we come to the millets. Now, at this point, the millets aren't standardized as millets, but they will become so in the 19th century. At this point, though, when we say millet, we're referring to a religious community that is not Sunni Muslim, and so they are not under the authority of the Shaykh al-Islam. Now, just as a clear note, Shiite Islam is not a recognized religion in the Ottoman Empire. There are Shiite Muslims within the borders of the Ottoman Empire, and so their situation is relatively precarious. They have their own ayatollahs to whom they report, but the ayatollahs do not have a voice in Topkapı Palace. That said, there are three major religions that do have a voice. The Jews are represented by their Hacham Pasha. The Armenians are represented by their Millet Pasha, and the Greek Orthodox are represented by their Patriarch. Now, the Millet Pasha of the Armenians is also responsible for all of the other Christianities that are non-Chalcedonian. So that includes Syriac Christians, Jacobites, Nestorians, Ethiopians, to the extent that they're in the empire. They are all subsumed under the and the Copts also, actually. They're all subsumed under the Millet Pasha, the Armenian Patriarchate, even though these groups have no functional alliance. Within the Ottoman Empire, they were seen as all being represented by the Armenians. And of course, the Greek Orthodox represented all orthodoxies. So regardless of whether their liturgical language was Old Church Slavonic, or it was Greek, or it was some other language, like Georgian, they were all seen as being part of the Greek Orthodox Church according to the Ottoman Empire's designations. And in the Jewish community, all Jews were represented by the Chacham Pasha. It didn't matter if they were Romaniot, which is the Jews of Greece, if they were Sephardim, which were the Jews of Spain. It didn't matter if they were Mizrahim, which anachronistically we can use this term to refer to the Jews of the Middle East who are not of Sephardic heritage. So all of these leaders had a number of different groups behind them. Now, the millets also had a number of restrictions. They could not bear arms or be in the military in order for them, or take a government post outside of simply being millet representative. So in order to do those things, they would have to convert to Islam. They were also forbidden from public celebrations, and church bells were banned. Now, for Jews, this didn't present much of a problem. Jews had generally kept their celebrations inside of the synagogue and did not use bells or other adornments on their synagogues to promote worship. That said, the Ottoman Empire had conquered a number of regions that had either been majority Catholic or majority Orthodox before, and so these rules came as a shock. A number of Orthodox churches were seen as incredibly beautiful and were appropriated by the Ottomans to be their own centers of worship. You can see here, this is Naos Aion Apostolon, or the Holy Apostles Church in Thessaloniki, Greece. During the Ottoman period, it was converted into a mosque as Souk Sujemi. When the Greeks recovered Thessaloniki in the Macedonian Wars, which is in the early 20th century, they rechristened this as a church. Now, the different millets were not all treated the same way. There was a lot of positive view towards the Jews, and there were several reasons for this. The Jews could not be connected with any particular sovereign, and so or any particular location where they were a majority. The possible exception being Thessaloniki, the city itself, because in that city, Jews were a little over half of the city's population. But the Jews were not nationalistic in any way, and they seemed to be extremely loyal to the Sultan, especially because he treated them better than they were treated in most other empires of the period. Jews also had large-scale networks throughout the Mediterranean and had their own languages in which they could communicate with co-religionists in other countries, allowing them to facilitate trade and to provide letters of credit and surety between two different locations. This was incredibly useful to the Sultan. The Christians were generally not seen as useful, but that's not to say that they weren't important. In fact, we developed, because of these three millets, the Greeks, the Jews, and the Armenians, we developed three districts in Istanbul that are designed to cater to these districts. You have the Balat district, which became the Jewish quarter, the Fener district, which became the Greek quarter, and the Kumkape district, which became the Armenian quarter. You can see this picture of the Fener district. This is actually from when the Greeks were still living there before the population exchange of 1923. You can see how beautiful the houses are right on the edge of the Haliç, or the Golden Horn. And you can see this family of Fanariotes, or Greeks from the Fener district, Fanariote, right from Fener. And you can see that they are incredibly wealthy and sophisticated. This actually drove a major wedge between the Fanariotes and the Greeks living in the countryside in what's now Greece and what's now Turkey. The Fanariotes were deeply connected to the Ottoman system, and they, as I said, they represented the Greeks in that system, all the Greeks. But the Greeks in the countryside didn't feel like these aristocratic Ottoman engaged individuals were really representing them. They felt like they were representing their part in the Ottoman system. And the same can be said of the Armenians who lived in eastern, what's now Turkey, and the Caucasus region, with those Armenians in Kumkape. There was a lesser extent to which this existed among the Jewish community, where they had fewer national aspirations. The Jews were less bothered by the way that the Jews of Balat represented their community. Now, when we talk about Christians in Constantinople, let's first talk about the three millets. So As I mentioned, we have Ottoman banks. These were run by Jews and Christians. This is actually an Ottoman bank in Alexandria that survives to this present day. And it was run by the Greeks. You can even see that there's Greek writing on the edge of the bank, even though it is in Alexandria, Egypt. And the Greeks were also, especially when we talk about Fanariotes, the Greeks from Fenar, that they were involved in shipping. And Greeks have a long and storied history of being involved in shipping and commerce. The Armenian upper class, called the Amira, similar to the Fanariotes, this is the Armenian equivalent. They were called the Amira, were made of several important families. There were the Duzyan, who directed the imperial mint and produced the Akçe coins for the Sultan. You had the Balyan family, who were the chief imperial architects, following in the wake of Mimar Sinan. All right, Mimar Sinan was not himself Armenian; he was an Ottoman Turk, but the actual labor and construction was organized by Armenians. And you also had the Dadyan family, who were the superintendents of the gunpowder mills. And eventually, when industry does come to the Ottoman Empire, the Dadyan family is very highly involved in the promotion and creation of industrial manufacture within the Ottoman state. When it came to Christians from outside of the empire, you had what were called the Ahidname, or usually translated in the West as capitulations, although charter might be a more accurate idea of what it is. Because the Ahidname created special requirements for the Genoese and Venetians at first, then the French, then the English and the Dutch, to trade in Constantinople. They were allowed to set up in certain districts. Those districts were enforced by the Sultan. But at the same time, they could bring up any grievances or issues directly with the Sultan, and the Sultan would take a 3% cut of everything that they brought in. But this was a relatively open trading system in terms of once you got an Ahidname, you could do work. It's worth pointing out that the Genoese and the Venetians are the only Catholic, and the French, those three are the only Catholic states that are permitted to acquire Ahidname. Habsburg Austrians and Habsburg Spanish were forbidden from doing so. And of course, the Dutch and the Portuguese were also forbidden. The Dutch and the English, as Protestants, were seen as potential allies of the Ottoman Empire, and so they didn't have issues in securing Ahidname, although it took a longer time for them to be more familiar with the process. That happened in the later 1600s, as opposed to the French, where it happened during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, and the Genoese and the Venetians, where it happened during the reign of Mehmet II, the conqueror. There's a question of, did they have Western influence in their fashion? Ottoman fashions began to reflect Western fashions once we get to the late 1700s, right? You can see the dress that the Fanariotes are wearing here, right? That's very much Western style dress, but that's a picture from the 19th century, right? So once we get into the late 1700s and this shift in the Ottoman Empire to sort of looking at the West and sort of trying to embrace to a certain degree Western fashions. You see this especially in Constantinople among wealthy individuals. But for the most part, and in most of the territories, the Ottomans dressed the same way that they had before, and with very little influence from Westerners. All right. So we now have international trade, and international trade in the Ottoman Empire focused primarily on four major entities: silk, spices, slaves, and pearls. When it comes to silk, the Ottoman Empire was producing its own silk as well as importing from China. And silk was especially commonly grown in the Levant region and in the western part of Anatolia. The largest silk market was the Bedesten in Bursa. You can see it actually still survives today. And these bolts of silk would then be sent to Europe, and generally through through Genoa or Venice using those ahidname permitted traders. There were also spices primarily collected through India. The Ottoman Empire, as we've discussed, maintained strong relations with Gujarat, which was an Indian state on the western part of India, and they also had their own trade relations with a number of states in East Africa, and they had a quasi-colony in Aceh, which is in northern Indonesia. And they brought those spices to the major markets in Constantinople. And from there, they made their way further west. You also had slavery. The Ottoman Empire was a massive slave importer and trader. The majority of the slaves that the Ottoman Empire brought in were white slaves. And those slaves, as I pointed out earlier, came through Crimea and the Khanate of Nogay, which were two Ottoman vassals on the north side of the Black Sea. Now, the Crimean slavers would bring their horses. You can see there in the central picture, they're the ones on the black horses. They would do raids into what is now Ukraine, but it was controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russians at this time. And they would run in, they would kidnap people and bring them back to Kaffa in order to sell them. It's estimated that between 1475 and 1790, when the majority of this trade occurred, roughly 3 million people, mostly women, like probably 2 to 1 women to men, were kidnapped in this fashion. I have a question. Was there any trend towards industrialization relative to silk, or was that better suited to smaller artisanal efforts? The large-scale manufacture of silk, like we think of today, with large-scale looms and the actual major development of clothing, that did not happen in the Ottoman Empire. When we're talking about silk in the Ottoman Empire, we're talking about it as a raw fabric and resource. Almost all the construction of silk garments, some of it was done artisanally in the Ottoman Empire, but most of it was done in Venice or in Genoa, where they had a lot more skill in assembling these silk pieces. I have another question about slavery. What is the Islamic teaching about slavery? Slavery, according to the Quran, is something that is permissible but undesirable. So you have situations in the Quran where where the slave can be manumitted, and what the process is for that. And it's not permitted to enslave another Muslim. That said, there's nothing in the Quran that prohibits slavery or seeks its eventual abolition. And so generally in the Islamic world, there was no pressure for abolition from a religious lens. Most of the abolition that occurred of slavery in the 20th century occurred because of pressure from Western countries signing treaties with Muslim states. And today, Muslims will say that slavery isn't permissible according to Islam, based on their own moral preconceptions of today. And if you ask scholars, they'll call it, Qanun al-Ahad, or law of treaty, I guess, because when you sign a treaty with a foreign power, it is binding on the Muslim community, just like a treaty with in any other political situation. And the Muslim countries have signed treaties opposing slavery, and so those treaties are binding on the Muslim population. There is a large-scale Islamic practice of slavery, and we have Islamic slavery in the form of trans-Saharan slavery. We have the Zanj, we have coastal raids, we have the Turkic enslavement, which led to the Mamluks, right, existing in Egypt. So there's definitely a large amount of slavery in the Islamic world, and the Ottoman Empire is no exception. I just think it's a little strong to say that Islam encourages slavery. It's more that it tolerates it and gives it legal sanction as a process that exists. Now, we also see that the So we have this massive slave trade and the slave markets in Istanbul, which buy them from the slave markets in Kaffa. We also see that the Ottoman Empire is able to secure its trade routes with India much more effectively when the English and Dutch begin to move into the Indian Ocean. The English and Dutch form an alliance with the Ottomans against the Portuguese, and they help the Ottomans clear a path to resume water navigation to India. One of the other, this is also why the English and Dutch had a much easier time getting a hidname when they wanted to trade with the Ottoman Empire. The final piece is that there's a lot of pearl collection in the Persian Gulf, and with Murad IV's conquest of Baghdad, the Ottoman Empire again had an outlet through Basra to the Persian Gulf, and these pearls were collected and sold to Europe. Now, the Europeans were less concerned with a lot of the trade that was going on in the Ottoman Empire, primarily because their intuitions and ambitions had shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and they were focused more on their colonies, especially because of mercantilism, right? Their philosophy of extracting wealth and bringing that home to the metropole didn't fit in with the Ottoman Empire in any serious way. That said, the Ottoman Empire increasingly becomes the equivalent of a mercantile colony in that it produces raw materials, sends those to Europe, and consumes the finished goods. One other thing to note is that Shah Abbas had an embargo on Ottoman products moving into the Persian Empire, but after he died, after he died, the situation became a lot more flexible, and trade began, especially through Armenians, because Armenians were recognized in the Ottoman Empire and were recognized in the Safavid Empire as sort of a neutral third party. Now, we had addressed the Mamluks in Egypt before they were conquered by Sultan Selim, and the Mamluks were rulers of Egypt, but they were originally themselves Turkic slaves that were sold by the Crimeans to Cairo, originally to the Ayyubid sultans, and then they rose up against the Ayyubid sultans in 1250 and took power in their own right, but they kept buying more slaves, and eventually they would free those slaves in the sense that they would give them the ability to become part of the ruling Mamluk dynasty, and they created that system of nobility of former Turkic slaves. Many of them were ethnic Circassians, many of them were ethnic Circassians, and in many cases, they had or they were other Turkic Kipchak peoples like the Kazakh. And so while they didn't speak the same Turkic language as the Ottomans, they did understand each other relatively well, and to a degree that the common people in Egypt especially didn't understand. We also mentioned that when Selim the Grim conquered the Mamluk Sultanate, he was very favorably received by the local populations, who were tired of how difficult the taxation regime was under the Mamluks. And so you can see, so for example, you had Amir Khair Beg Cherkesi of Aleppo, and he literally just opens the doors of Aleppo to Selim, no battle at all to defend his city. You have the Battle of Majtabik, which was a resounding victory for Selim's forces against those of the Mamluk Sultanate. You see his reception in Damascus by the emir there. Most of the territories, including Egypt, that were under the Mamluks, were more than happy to fall under the Ottoman Sultanate. There was an issue, though, when it came to legitimacy, because the Arabs understood what the caliph was, and once Selim had appropriated to himself the title of caliph, there became a huge problem as to whether or not he could truly own that title. Now, in the line of succession of caliphs, in the Sunni tradition, which almost all of the Arab world operates under the Sunni tradition. You have Muhammad, and Muhammad gives permission to those within the Quraysh tribe to rule the Islamic world. Muhammad is himself of one of these tribes, the Banu Hashim. But there are, one of these clans, the Banu Hashim, but there are other clans like the Banu Umayyah, which form the Umayyads, or the Banu Abbas, which are the Abbasids. The Abbasids are actually part of Banu Hashim as well. But you have all of these caliphs, almost all being from that Quraysh tribe. So they have that air of legitimacy. You also have, for example, the Saadians and Alawites in Morocco, who are Sharifians. You have the Hafsids also, until they were overthrown, who had inaugurated their own caliphate and considered themselves to have Arab heritage. The Ottomans themselves, though, were clearly not of this ancestry. And so they had to contend with that issue of legitimacy. They also had to contend with the fact that the governing style of the Arab world was incredibly rural, just as it was in Anatolia and Rumelia, but it was rural in a way that was very well ensconced in tradition and development. This was the system of the Hakam. Now, it's sort of difficult to explain exactly what a Hakam is, other than that it's a tribal elder who makes decisions based on a personal understanding of the law. But one of the strange gifts of modernity is that we now have a TV show where Steve Harvey pretends to be a judge and issues verdicts. In this show, the way that Steve Harvey behaves, aside from when he talks to the audience and sort of panders to them, he behaves very similarly to a Hakam, in that he doesn't require jurisprudential procedure to be followed. He doesn't care about rules of evidence. He just has a conversation with the litigants. The conversation often veers into things that are not legally relevant. And he comes to decisions that are other than strictly monetary results. He may tell people to reconcile. He may ask somebody to do a job for him. And so, as hilarious as I think the show is, and I recommend it on that basis, he's not paying me. If you want to get an idea of what a Hakam is and what this Arab style of jurisprudence was, that is actually a really great outlet to sort of see it modernized and contemporized in a way that is more accessible to us in the West. So, but this Hakam system was based on centuries of development and being ingratiated into the communities in which it sits. And that was something with the Ottoman system of bringing these janissaries and diplomats who had been schooled in madrasis in Istanbul. That relationship was not going to work unless both sides gave in a little bit. And so in Egypt, what ended up happening was what was called the Neo-Mamluks. So you had the Mamluks who were ruling Egypt, who had their power now marrying into the Janissary core that was moved there. And so you began to have these sort of noble families developing in Egypt. And as long as these noble families were in control, these sort of hybrid Janissary Mamluk families, these Neo-Mamluks, they were able to control the process of Ottoman governance in the area and impose, for want of a better term, Ottoman law. Now, for most Egyptians, very little changed. There was a better tax regime under the Ottomans than there had been under the Mamluks, so the strain was not as bad on the common people. But the methods of exploitation of the Nile were still incredibly labor intensive. There was a shift, though, to planting sugarcane and rice due to the desires in Constantinople. Egypt became one of the major breadbaskets of the Ottoman Empire. It also was the second largest city. And the Ottoman sultans always kept a close eye on Cairo to make sure that Cairo could never be governed by the same person for long enough to establish a loyal following and possibly rebel. So we then look at the other areas of the Arab world, and we see places like Tunis, northern Iraq, Lebanon, um, the Hijaz region, which is Western Saudi Arabia. And you can see if you look on the map that all these regions are autonomous, right? These are the regions that are the most difficult for the Ottomans to control. And so they allowed individuals who could rule almost in their own right, as long as they declared vassalage to the Ottomans and paid taxes, to be part of the Ottoman Empire. So you have the Aghas, who ruled the Kurdish provinces, you have the Sharif, who ruled Mecca, and you have the Beyler Bey of Tunis. Lebanon we're going to talk about because it's a lot more complicated. And all of these individuals had what were called iltizam, which were land farms. So while the Timar was given to somebody who was a Ghazi or a Sipahi, somebody who was in the Turkish light cavalry, these iltizam or tax farms were almost like a bidding system. So you would be allocated an amount of territory by the Sultan. You would not own it, of course. It was still Arazi Miri, but you were allocated it for the usufruct. And you had a tax requirement to deliver every year to the Sultan based on the amount of land that you controlled. Whatever you made in excess of that was yours to keep as profit. And you would tax the peasantry and collect from them. So this iltizam system was a lot less personal than the prior tax systems had been, and allowed for these autonomous states to effectively collect their taxes and send that back to Constantinople. Now, one of the things to notice about all of these states is that all these autonomous states is they have one of three things in common. They have one of the following three things going for them. One is that they are incredibly distant from Constantinople. That's the case of Algeria, of Tunis, of the eastern part of Libya. These are areas that are very difficult for the Ottomans to get to, and so they get autonomy because of the distance that it takes to get to them. Another one is that they're in the middle of the desert or close to the borders, which is what happens in the Sharifate of Mecca. That's what happens in the regions surrounding the Persian Gulf. And so these regions are desert regions, hard to police, and so the local tribes are given a lot of leeway there. And then, of course, the third is the mountains, which is where you have Lebanon and the Kurds. And because the mountains are so difficult to police as well, these local individuals are given more autonomy to operate there. When it comes to Lebanon, we really have a fight between a number of different local clans. Some of these clans, like Ali Janbulad, were Kurds. Some of these clans, like the Asaf clan, were Sunni Turkmen. Some of these clans, like the Ma'an clan, were Druze. That's Druze. It's another religion. We'll discuss that in a bit. And these different clans were fighting over power in the Lebanon mountain area. Now, just to clarify what a Druze is. So we're starting to drift into the period when post-Islamic religions come into existence. We've already talked about Alevis, and we've talked about Druze before. When I say that these are post-Islamic religions, these are religions, right, that we've talked about in the first lecture, where you have a number of different attributes that they typically tend to have that put them outside of the normal specter of Islam, despite the fact that their founders and their original followers were all Muslims. The first one is that they argue that there's prophecy after Muhammad. The second one is that they venerate Ali, or Ali, the fourth caliph, or they give him some sort of God status. There's a question about Tawheed, or the unity of God, because of the veneration for Ali. Whether these religions are syncretic or reinterpretive of Islamic doctrines, syncretic with other religions, right, or interpretive of Islamic doctrines, and whether they believe in Batiniya, or secret meanings about the world. And you can see that while the Druze don't really have prophecy after Muhammad, they do venerate Ali very strongly. They are rather reinterpretive of Islamic doctrines, and they do believe in this Batiniya, this esoteric understanding of reality. And so if we go back to the Druze, one of the defining aspects of Druze belief is that the sixth Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim disappeared one night and was believed to have achieved a massive revelation. according to the Druze. And so this revelation was distilled by his acolytes and followers into what were called the Epistles of Wisdom, Rasail al-Hikmah. And no version of the Epistles of Wisdom in its full text has been recovered by Western scholars. And this is primarily because the Druze divide themselves in two populations. They have what are called the Juhal, or ignorant people, and the Uqal, or the wise people. In order to become an Uqal, an Akil, you have to study for 40 years, and then you are admitted and told the secrets and given the holy book. Only those who are supremely educated in this way know that actual religious tenets of Druze. Only they are required to pray, but their word is almost entirely binding on the Druze community because of their religious knowledge being so specific. Druze do not pray in a mosque, they pray in a place called a maqam, which literally means place. And the maqam meets on Thursdays for what's called khilwa, or their version of prayer. And Druze, unlike Muslims who believe in a singular life that ends in an afterlife of either going to paradise or to hell, the Druze believe in reincarnation, that every person will be born and reborn into the world following their death. Now, the Druze primarily live in what's now northern Israel, southwestern Syria, and in Lebanon. So if we go back and discuss the Lebanese situation, we now have this sort of struggle. Now, Ali Jambulad launched a revolt against the Ottoman government for independence of his region, and was openly working with Europeans in the possibility of starting another crusade, right? He was Kurdish, and he and his father or his uncle had been killed by the sultans, and so he wanted an enemy. He wanted an ally against that enemy, and so he was willing to work with the Crusaders and Europeans, especially the Grand Duke of Tuscany. I have a question. Does Islam believe in reincarnation like the Druze? No. Islam believes in a singular life with an end where eventually you go to heaven and hell after passing through divine judgment. So Ali Jambulad I have another sort of comment. Al-Hakim was an Ismaili Muslim, the esoteric Shiite theology that was the foundation of the Order of the Assassins. That's true, but I just want to clarify that the Druze don't have any connection to the Assassins. It was the Nizari Ismailis who came later out of the Fatimids that developed this. All right. So after Ali Jambulad was captured and executed in 1610, the Grand Duke of Tuscany was looking for allies in the region of Lebanon, and he was able to find one in Fakhreddin II Ma'an, who, as I said, was Druze. Fakhreddin had conquered most of the southern part of Lebanon. You can see on the map, it's the brown area, and was beginning to move against the Tripoli Eyalet and the Jabla Sanjak. So he would unite all of what is today Lebanon and some of what is the coastal region of Syria, as well as some of the northern parts of what is today Israel. When he controlled this territory, he reached out to the Grand Duke of Tuscany and made an agreement with him, saying that he would protect the Maronites, who are the Catholic population of Mount Lebanon, and create a Maronite Druze alliance in exchange for financial support from the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And if the Tuscans were going to begin a crusade, that they would fight together. Of course, such a crusade never actually materialized, but the relationship that Fakhreddin II made between the Druze and the Maronites is often seen by Lebanese today as the foundation of the cross-confessional unity within Lebanon. That said, Fakhreddin II was taken by the Ottomans. He was seen as being too powerful. And so they sent a military force to defeat him. He was jailed and killed in 1633. Sorry, he was jailed in 1633. He was killed in 1635. And his successors, though, continued his empire, although it lost a province or two. In 1658, him and one or two other Druze clans began to contest the territory of Lebanon, and the situation was resolved by Köprülü Mehmet Paşa, who, after 90 minutes, were finally meeting. This was just before he became Grand Vizier. He resolved this. While he was Grand Vizier, he came down and resolved the situation. The Ma'an were weakened in their power, but they still maintained most of Lebanon when he was done with them. Now, it's interesting to sort of point out that we talked about the millet system that recognizes Judaism, Christian, and certain types of Christianity. Druze was never officially acknowledged or officially condemned, although most Sunnis would consider Druze to be heretics. They were not actually punished for their beliefs, and to the extent that Lebanon was autonomous because it was mountainous, there were never any rules against the Druze religion promulgated within the area that is historically Druze territory during the Ottoman rule. So now we're going to meet this family. So Köprülü is the Ottoman Turkish name for the family, but there are two dialects of our Albanian language. There's Greg and Tosk. And so the name of the family in Albanian can either be represented as Köprülyoti or Cipriliu, which both sound very different from each other. So let's just go with Köprülü because that's the name that most historians give them. Now, the Köprülü sultans were one relatively large extended family. Now, there were intermediate sultans. You can see that the number goes 111, 112, 113, 116, 119, 125. So you can see that there are gaps here. But these six grand viziers were all relatives, right? Mehmet's two sons, Ahmed and Mustafa, ruled, and two son-in-laws of his ruled, Kara Mustafa and Abaza Siyavush Pasha, and his nephew, Amjazade Köprülü Hussein. All these six ruled, and with the exception of about 10 years in this period, for about 50 years, these sultans ruled this territory. Sorry, these grand viziers ruled the Ottoman territory. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Köprülü Mehmet. He grew up in the city of what's now Roshnik, Albania, which is in the southern region close to Berat. And he sort of entered the court just as Sheikhul Islam Hojazade Mesud Effendi and a number of the Janissaries were planning a revolt against Sultan Mehmed IV. He was in a very precarious situation, and his mother, Turhan, Hatice Turhan Sultan, decided that he needed somebody who would be able to step in and effectively prevent these kinds of attacks. So I have two questions here. When I say family, I'm referring to the fact that it's him, his sons, his son-in-laws, and his nephew. It's within what we would normally consider a family. I'm not talking about a clan or anything. And then there's a question of what is the role of the Grand Vizier? The Grand Vizier is the most powerful appointed official by the Sultan. And so the role of the Grand Vizier is actually greatly expanded as the role of the Sultan itself has significantly diminished, right? The Ottoman sultans, the first 10 sultans from Osman I to Suleiman I, these sultans were incredibly powerful. And then during the reign of Selim II, right, the Sultanate of Women, the power of the Sultan significantly decreased. And so the Grand Vizier had some power, but was not as powerful as before. But Mehmet, Köprülü Mehmet, really increased the power of the Sultan. Sorry, really increased the power of the Grand Vizier, so that he was the voice of the Ottoman Empire. And you can see why I keep having that slip of calling him a Sultan, because he effectively was one. Now, as soon as he came to power, he made an agreement with Hatice Turhan that Mehmet IV was no longer going to be in a position of power. So he actually sent Mehmet IV to Edirne to go hunting. You can see him there on the right-hand side. He's on the white horse. He was a young kid at the time, a teenager. And Köprülü Mehmet made Mehmet IV promise him that he would not let anything interfere with Köprülü Mehmet's rule, no suspicions, no issues, nothing, no matter what the other people in the court said. And because of this, Köprülü Mehmet engaged in a number of purges because of revolts from different parts of the government as he consolidated power. In January of 1657, there was a Sipahi revolt, and so he got the Janissaries to kill off all the Sipahi that were involved in the revolt. He intercepted a letter from Parthenius III, who was the Greek patriarch at the time, and that letter was to Russia. Köprülü Mehmet interpreted this letter as asking for aid, and so he killed Parthenius, which is why he has the title Hero Martyr in the Orthodox Church. He was given one last ability to pardon himself. If he converted to Islam, his execution would be foregone, but he chose to die an Orthodox Christian, and so he has the title Hero Martyr. So you have a number of these purges that Köprülü Mehmet is doing, and there are individuals that don't react well to this. One of them is Abaza Hasan Pasha, who is one of the Turkish governors of Aleppo in Syria. You can see the Aleppo citadel, which was his central base of operations. In 1651, he revolted for the first time as a Jalali revolter with a number of his Sekban soldiers. But when Kösem was killed in 1651 and he was paid off and given titles, he relented. But seeing all of these executions by Köprülü Mehmet made him revolt again in 1659, and in this time he was taken prisoner. He and those Turks that had rebelled alongside him were told that if they surrendered, that they would be treated peacefully. They were not. They were all killed. And Abaza Hasan Pasha was never an issue ever again. Shots were fired from the Aleppo citadel to signify that he was disposed of and that a new governor would come to Aleppo. So it's also worth pointing out that the military is changing substantially in this period. So Murad IV in 1634 abolished devshirme. That's not to say that it didn't continue. It did, but it continued in sort of a bit of a trickle for the next 60 years or so. And so the majority of the Janissaries were now coming not from being the sons of devshirme, but from actual recruitment. You had a number of Bosnians, Albanians, Turks, and other Muslims, because it was Muslim only. Or if you were a non-Muslim person, you had to convert to Islam to join the Janissaries. But that was the way that the Janissaries were growing, and they needed to grow substantially because gunpowder was the effective way of fighting at this point. And the Janissaries were the rifle bearers in the empire. And so because of this, you have a decrease in the number of Sipahis, a decrease in the strength of the Timariot, right? Because the Timariot's advantage is that they can bring Sipahi to the battle. The Sipahi are less desirable. And because these Janissaries are coming from the local population, they are able to have their own families. Janissaries had previously been forbidden from having families. And we also have the increasing standardization of the Sekban, or these irregular musket carrying or rifle carrying soldiers who don't have the training of the elite Janissary Corps, but fill out the rest of the Ottoman ranks as the army shifts towards being more of an infantry gunpowder army than one on horseback. So I sort of wanted to give sort of a window into Köprülü Mehmet's character, aside from his purges and executions. And one of the ways that we can do this is with the Ayazma Kapı fire. Now, the Ayazma Kapı fire was a fire that started in Istanbul and burnt down a significant section of the old city, especially the neighborhood of Balat, right, the Jewish district. And you can see Ahridam Mosque, which still survives, I believe, in the Balat district, was burnt during this period. Köprülü Mehmet reached into his own finances to rehabilitate a number of the burnt out neighborhoods, and he actually forced the state to buy at real estate value the worst destroyed areas in the Jewish district in Balat. I have a question. Why were the Grand Viziers allowed to be non-Turkish? How were they selected? The Grand Viziers were one of the things to sort of keep in mind about this period is that religion is the more important marker than ethnicity per se. So the fact that these Albanians were Muslim meant that they were Muslim like any other Muslim. And so there wasn't a strict requirement that a person be Turkish. It was that a person be competent. So once the Sultan appointed a Grand Vizier, that's how they came into power. Köprülü Mehmet himself, when he first moved from Rushnik in Albania to Constantinople, he actually worked in the kitchen and slowly got promotions and upgrades and spent more time around the right people. And that's how he managed to cultivate a relationship with Hatice Turhan Sultan. And when she saw the kind of person he was and that she could establish a good rapport with him, she became his strongest backer in the court, and she was the one who convinced her son, Mehmet IV, to appoint him as Grand Vizier. And once his record had been solidified, he was able to bring his son into the profession, and so on. So it was sort of a who do you know kind of thing. Okay. So we then have Transylvania, which was a Hungarian vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, trying to break free. And the region, and the thing is that George II Rakoczy saw an opportunity to invade Poland-Lithuania, expand his power, and therefore achieve independence. Of course, as a vassal state, he was not allowed to do this. He would require authority from the Sultan in order to declare war on anybody. But in 1657, he did that, and he declared war on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. At that time, they were dealing with an internal revolt of their own from the Cossacks led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And Bogdan Khmelnytsky is one of the founders of the modern Ukrainian identity as a result of these Cossack fights against the Poles. The reason they were rioting was that they considered the Polish government to be taking over their land unnecessarily. At this same time, Poland was involved in what was known as the Second Northern War, which was an expansionary war by Sweden. That war has also been called the Deluge, and it's called that because the Russians invaded Poland from the east, and the Swedes invaded it from the north and west. And so almost all of Poland was partitioned between these two powers at the height of the war. Eventually, the war turned around and Poland was able to reassert itself. But the Transylvanians fought effectively on the Swedish side against the Poles as an attempt to secure their independence. Mehmet Köprülü was thoroughly disinterested in this and wanted to make sure that Transylvania became a functioning state. So in 1660, he launched a quick invasion into Transylvania, and he came to Jalu Castle, which is where George II Rakoczy was, and he killed him. As you can see, that seems to be Mehmet Köprülü's solution to a lot of things. But it worked. Transylvania became part of the Ottoman Empire again, and the successive leaders were a lot less willing to challenge Ottoman power, at least for the next few decades. Now, if we take a little bit of time back, during the reign of Deli Ibrahim, Crazy Ibrahim from the 1640s, he was convinced, against much better judgment, to invade the island of Crete. And the island of Crete was the last Venetian hold in the Aegean Sea. So it made sense to attack the island, and the Venetians were kept off guard long enough for the Ottomans to land significant forces and take the major cities on the island, like Chania, like Rethymno. But there was the city of Candia, modern-day Heraklion, which was built as a Venetian fortress. And you can sort of see a mock-up of what Heraklion looks like. In this picture, north is down. So the port is actually on the northern side of the island, as you can see from the picture. Now, this war had been going on since 1645. And so by the time that Köprülü was in power, this war had already been going on for 15 years. The siege at Candia, at Heraklion, was the second longest siege in recorded history. And by the time it ended in the 1670s, it had been over 20 years of siege. But Köprülü Mehmet was able to make some notable gains here. The first was that in 1664, he had turned in 1660, after defeating George II Rakoczy, he brought his army to the border with the Habsburgs, and they fought several wars, but the Habsburgs were far more concerned with the situation on their western border with the French. And so they signed the Treaty of Vashvad with the Ottoman Empire, a treaty which confirmed the Ottoman Empire's holdings in southern Europe and allowed the Ottomans the ability to move more soldiers into Crete and deal with the situation more directly. Another major thing is that he won a major victory in the Battle of the Dardanelles, giving him control of the islands of Lemnos and Tenedos. Tenedos today is part of Turkey. It's the island of Bozcaada. Lemnos is part of Greece today. But this Battle of the Dardanelles meant that the Venetians, despite having a superior navy, could not cut off the Ottoman supply routes to the island of Crete and to the siege at Heraklion, at Candia. So we end up having a situation where the Venetians are fighting against the Ottomans, and it cost them around 4.3 million ducats, which bankrupted their entire empire. They didn't even have enough ships to fight, so they paid Dutch and English mercenaries to join them. And in the sea battles, most of those sea battles were Venetian victories, but eventually it came to the point that none of those sea victories could be converted into taking any of the islands, despite how close to the islands they may have been. This led Mehmet's son, who became the next Ottoman vizier, Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, Fazıl meaning the wise one or the thoughtful one. And he created a treaty with Venice. The siege at Candia would be lifted, all of Crete would become part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Venetians would be able to expand some of their holdings closer to modern Dubrovnik in what's now Croatia. The Ottoman Empire, though, was very much bankrupted by this long-scale war and that siege. That said, there's no rest for the weary. So we've seen before those Cossacks, and now that Bogdan Khmelnytsky is dead, they've styled themselves as the Zaporozhian host, and they exist on the southern border of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a very interesting sort of entity, so it merits taking a few seconds to discuss it. It is one of the few countries with an elected monarchy. So the nobles will convene in what's called the Commonwealth Sejm, and in the Sejm, they will vote on who the king is, and the king only has limited powers. For example, it is the Sejm who provides the king permission to recruit a military. It's the Sejm that provides the king funding for any of his major activities. And so, in a sense, Poland is somewhere between a monarchy and a democratic institution. Never mind the fact that it's actually two countries fused into one, the eastern half being the Lithuanian half and the western half being the Kingdom of Poland. Lithuania was considered a Grand Duke primarily because when it was established, it was a pagan state, and so they couldn't have the title of king. Now, Lithuanians by this time were Catholic, but the title Grand Duke had stuck. Now, the Zaporozhian host of Cossacks was now under threat from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the west and from the Russians in the east. And so they turned to the Ottoman Empire to support them in revolting against the Poles. And to that end, they were successful. As you can see in the map below, the areas in orange, red slash are areas that the Zaporozhians took from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the areas in blue slash are areas that the Ottoman Empire took from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well. One of the interesting things to point out is that there were Muslims living in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well. These are the Lipka Tatars. And these Lipka Tatars lived towards Poland's southern border, and Poland had a long history of being religiously tolerant. Poland had a huge Jewish community. It also had a smaller but still significant Muslim community, and these Lipka Tatars were part of that Muslim community. Because of the increasing Catholicization of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Lipka Tatars had gone into rebellion at roughly this same time. The only reason the Poles were able to consolidate their territories and not completely lose, because the Sejm kept refusing to pay for a military budget, was the military strength and command of Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland from 1674 until 1696. And Jan III Sobieski was originally a hetman, which is a leading military general in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the Sejm confer upon him the title of king. And of course, when you bring up Jan Sobieski, that naturally leads to the Great Siege of Vienna. The second, that's how it's colloquially known. It is actually the Second Siege of Vienna, and it's led by Kara Mustafa Pasha. Kara Mustafa Pasha was involved in the war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on behalf of the Zaporozhian host. And so he had some military experience, but he wanted, and he had acquired territory, as we saw, for the Ottoman Empire. The last time the Ottoman Empire would ever acquire territory. And he wanted to do what no Ottoman had done before, what had even evaded Suleiman I, which was to take Vienna. Now, there are a lot of things that are said about this campaign which I think are overblown in one direction or the other. The first is that if Vienna had fallen, the Ottomans would have been knocking on the door of Western Europe, and that there's a chance that there would have been an Ottoman army at Paris, that Europe would have gone Muslim or something similar to that. I think that that's overblown. I don't think the Ottoman supply lines, although they were very good for their time period, could reach that far. I think that much more likely to be under threat would have been Italy, and that Italy would have been targeted. There's also the view from the other side, that Kara Mustafa had no idea what he was doing, that he was reaching far beyond the capabilities of the Ottoman Empire, and that a siege of Vienna would be functionally impossible. And so we got what he should have expected. That's also far from the truth. The Ottoman siege of Vienna was practically a success. The Ottomans lost half of their artillery on the way to Vienna, which meant that they only, because of the wet ground over which they transported those cannons. But even still, Kara Mustafa brought roughly 150,000 Turks to Vienna, and they camped on the southwestern side of the city, the northern and eastern sides being protected by rivers. And the Ottoman tactic was to dig under the city with their sappers and plant bombs at the seat of the walls, which actually exploded and brought down sections of the wall. The Austrians commanded an incredible defense, despite being extremely beleaguered. There were only 15,000 Austrians at the beginning of the defense, and the leading defender actually died in the middle of the defense, and he was replaced. The only reason that the Viennese survived was that Jan III Sobieski brought in the winged hussars from Poland, creating the first real alliance between the Habsburgs and the Austrians, which was something that, the Habsburgs and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was something that had no real precedent and was something that Kara Mustafa really could not have expected. That said, the winged hussars were incredibly lethal to the Ottoman force, and Kara Mustafa didn't properly engage them. This led to an entire routing of the Ottoman army, and it's the first time since the Battle of Ankara in 1402 that we covered in lesson 14 or 15. 14. Where an entire Ottoman army is just destroyed and does not come back in any form. Kara Mustafa, of course, for his hubris, was strangled in Belgrade, and you can see the execution memorialized below. One thing to sort of point out is that the Hungarians were divided on whether they should support the Habsburgs or not, and there was a Hungarian group led by Emmerich Tököly, you can see him in the upper right-hand side, who sided with Kara Mustafa Pasha and fought with him outside the gates of Vienna. Now, his troops didn't do particularly well. They got bored after about a month and a half of sieging, and so they just left. But the Austrians couldn't count on the Hungarians to be their strong allies, despite both being Catholic, because of the Austrian tendency to try to control control Hungary, and in particular in areas where they did take control from the Hungarians. Did take control from the Ottomans. They were even more repressive than the Ottomans, and there are documents from that period that demonstrate that a lot of the poor actually wanted to go back under Ottoman control rather than be ruled by their co-religionists. So after 1683, with the new Catholic League starting between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Austrians, we start to see the Ottoman Empire on the back foot, and this Holy League, which now even includes Russia, despite Russia being an Orthodox state, all of Europe has aligned against the Ottoman Empire, and it's a grueling set of battles between 1684 and 1699. In particular, you have the Battle of Zenta, where Sultan Mustafa II was in the camp on the border of the River Tisa, and this attack, led by the Austrians, the Austrian Habsburgs, completely destroys the Ottoman ranks, as well as running away with a significant part of the Ottoman treasury. After that, the victory was almost a foregone conclusion, and you had the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. Now, it's important to point out that the Treaty of Karlowitz was the first time that the Ottoman Empire was subjected to the rules of warfare that the Europeans developed in the 30 Years' War, specifically the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Under those rules, all nations were equal stakeholders in the Commonwealth of Nations, and nations could bargain and organize diplomatic solutions at the end of war that weren't necessarily commensurate with their gains or losses in the war. And the Ottomans had no idea how to negotiate this, considering that this would not be imposed in Turkish, but would be negotiated in Italian. And no Turk had ever learned Italian. So it fell upon the Fanariotes to negotiate the treaty, specifically Alexandra Mavrocordatos, who took on the title of Dragoman. And the Ottoman title of Dragoman meant the translator. And these Dragoman were incredibly important in the Ottoman governing system because they were the ones who spoke the foreign languages, despite the fact that they were Millets, they weren't Sunni Muslims. They became the chief diplomats and negotiators for the Ottomans. And the Treaty of Karlowitz wasn't as bad as it could have been, although it was the single worst treaty that the Ottoman Empire had probably would sign until the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. And you can see the vast amount of territory that they lost in blue to the Venetians, in green to the Habsburgs, in pink to the Poles, and in burgundy to the Russians. I have a question of, was this war entirely because the Ottomans were so weakened to ensure it didn't become strong again, or is it both? I think the Europeans saw an opportunity to take the Ottomans down because Kara Mustafa was basically stranded without an army, and then he was killed. So you had this attempt to try and rehabilitate the empire. In the Battle of Zenta, a Grand Vizier was killed, and that's when Amjazadeh Köprülü Hüseyin takes power, right? The last Köprülü Grand Vizier takes power and tries to stop the hemorrhaging. But it was really the Europeans coming together and deciding that they were all going to fight together, and that had sort of been proved at Vienna that the different European powers could all fight together. All right. One last thing that I want to point out is that at this time, we see another small state arising in the Middle East, and they are from the Ibadiyya sect. And the Ibadiyya sect is from a descendant of the Kharijites, the first non-Sunni Shiite group. And so the Ibadiyya, as we remember, they were one of the four coalitions in the second fitna, in the second great Islamic war in the 800s. Their territory here is in the yellow. And when the Portuguese controlled the naval routes, they controlled the Omani coast. And you can see in this map here all of the fortresses along the Omani coast. So this Portuguese colonization was incredibly devastating to Oman. And you can see Portuguese abuses of the Omanis. This is actually a picture of Spanish abuses to Native Americans, but it's many of the same kinds of things. You had physical mutilation, you had whippings, and the Omanis took a while before they united behind a leader, but they finally did come behind Nasser bin Murshid, who created the Imamate of Oman. And you can see from the map on the right-hand side that the red area is where the Ya'urubi Imamate started, and they began to conquer other territories. Those territories in green were under Portuguese control. Those areas in brown were under the control of local hakams, but were generally lawless areas. And the Ya'urubis began to unite this territory, finally conquering Muscat, the current capital of Oman, in 1650. Now, the conquest of Muscat eventually led these Omanis to repurpose the Portuguese ships, learn the craft of moving through naval areas, and they were able to eject the Portuguese from their colonies in Africa. You can see this is Fort Jesus, which was built by the Portuguese in Mombasa, Kenya. The Omanis besieged it in 1696 and recovered it from the Portuguese, expelling them. And the Omanis began to set up their own colonial situation in these areas along the coast of Africa. You can see Kilwa Kisiwani, which is ruins today, but was a massive trading fortress, especially in African gold. A little bit before this period, but also during this period. Also, Pemba Island and Zanzibar became part of this Ottoman Empire. In fact, the sultans of Zanzibar, which existed until the 20th century, were all descended from an Omani lineage. And you can see they still carry the khanjar, or the Arab curved dagger, which is the symbol of Oman because of that Omani legacy. They also would later conquer territories along the coast of Iran and modern Pakistan. So, any last questions?
Well, first of all, Richard, I want to thank you again. Amazing presentation. I guess, question on Khmelnytsky. Do you think he was more of a creation or development of the Ukrainian identity, or of a support of the Zaporozhye or Kazakhs, and therefore more of a Russian creation, so to speak? What is your personal opinion?
I don't really have a strong opinion on where the Cossacks come from. I think that to say that it's one or the other, I think is a little strong. I think the right way to think about it is when the United States was expanding westward, right? And you had all these settlers that were sent to take new lands. These settlers became armed, right? Because they had to deal with Native Americans. As much as we may talk about it, encounters between settlers and Native Americans were not always pleasant. And so these people learned how to fight. These people learned how to defend their homesteads, create coalitions, and all these kinds of things. Very similarly, these Russians who were sent to the edges of either the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or to the edges of the Russian Tsardom, were people that were interacting with the Khanate of the Khanate of Crimea and the Khanate of Nogai, and these were violent attackers, and so they had to develop a system for effectively fighting against that. So I think that they're a creation of the Russian state in the sense that Russians sent them there, and they had to eke out a living, but I don't think the Russians intentionally engendered this self identity in the same way that I don't think Americans intentionally created the Wild West mentality. I think that was sort of a development of the environment that they were in.
Right. I mean, I definitely want to do, maybe in collaboration, we can do Khmelnytsky Revolt. Very interesting, extremely interesting. I just wanted to gain, because up until I think today, a lot of the Ashkenazi Jews harbor, obviously what he did to the Ashkenazi Jew community, Jewish community.
Well, the thing is that Khmelnytsky was virulently anti-Semitic, but his anti-Semitism wasn't predominantly from a religious lens. It did exist there, but it wasn't predominantly from a religious lens. It was primarily from an economic lens, because in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Jews had a very specific economic role, which is that they were the tax collectors, right? And so they were the visible representation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth government to these Cossack people. And it was that government and that control over their lives that they so resented, right? So the easiest way to demonstrate that they were opposed to the Commonwealth is to mass murder Jews, right? That was the fundamental basis of his activity. And so it's not the same kind of anti-Semitism as a racial or religious anti-Semitism. It's something more akin to more akin to the economic anti-Semitism that sometimes we see of, like, Jews being the bankers and Jews control the money, that sort of thing. I have a question of how can we access this recording as well as the previous lessons. The link to all the previous MENA recordings is in the meetup page for this. If you go back, it says all previous MENA recordings. This recording, is it being live streamed, Zach, or no?
Yeah, it's live stream. I mean,
Yeah, it's live stream.
Yeah, no. Perfect,
it's very easy. We're on YouTube, and our channel is called Fitness. Sorry, History, Fitness, Investing. That's all it is. Just type those three.com, and it should be right there. But I can also send the link right here. I'll post the link.
Yeah, if you can put the link right there, that would be helpful. Yeah, so that's where you can find all the previous lectures and all of the other discussions. Somebody's sort of jokingly commenting, mass murder doesn't strike me as easy. Well, it's significantly easier when you realize that the Cossacks were all armed to the teeth because they had been fighting the Crimean Khanate, and the Jews were forbidden from carrying arms. So yeah, so everybody can, if they look in the chat window, they can see the link to the channel. And within the channel, there's a playlist called Middle Eastern and North African History Series. And that is where all the videos in this series are. I encourage you to watch all of them because I am just absolutely stunning and I have a massive ego on my shoulders. But you might learn something. So I sort of wanted to give an idea about what's going on next week. So next week, we are going to focus a little bit more in on Russia and the Russo-Turkish Wars. Now, the Russo-Turkish Wars, there are 12 of them. I will not be doing a step-by-step like, this is this war, this is what happened, this is this war, this is what happened, because that'll get really tedious really quickly. But what I will do is sort of walk us through the development of Russia and the development of the Ottoman Empire and how those two developments are not occurring at the same speed. And the expansion of Russia has a massive collision with the Ottoman Empire, and it changes a lot of the internal situation. Wayne, do you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yes, we hear.
All right. I didn't know. I thought just talking. Richard, you're just wonderful.
Thank you.
Do you know all of this or do you read it? How do you gather up all this information?
I'm familiar with a lot of the basics. I read to flesh it out. But yeah, I mean, yeah, so like a lot of this stuff, like, I mean, if you woke me up in the middle of the night, I could probably do about an hour of this 2 hours.
Wonderful. Just wonderful. I love history. I love to learn about it. But the names, the dates, the periods, it's just overwhelming.
Well, I mean, it does help the fact that I've written the date numbers out there. So the thing is that these slides are my notes for when I'm talking. So like I see a picture and I remember what I'm going to say about it. So that helps a lot.
And you're a dragoman.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, great job, Richard. Awesome presentation.
Yeah, wonderful job.
Now, what's your specialty? Europe or the Middle East or the Mediterranean? Do you have any?
My specialty tends to be the Middle East. That's why I wanted to do this series. And so far it's been going, I think, really well. I understand European history to a certain degree. The thing is that with the Ottoman Empire, and you've probably seen it in the previous lectures, if you've looked there, the Ottoman Empire tends to be very Europe lensed. And that's because the Ottoman emperors, the Ottoman sultans themselves were very European looking, and the Janissaries were very European looking. And so a lot of their wars were consumed with Europe. Like in this period, like I covered almost all the major Arab wars in the 1600s. It was pretty much all the Lebanese stuff. And to a certain degree, some minor scuffles in Iraq, which I didn't cover, but they don't really change much. What really changes in the Middle Eastern world happens at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and then really in the 20th century. And so when we finally get to those centuries, our focus thankfully will shift back to the Middle East, and we'll learn less about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and more about Naserists and things like that. I have a question. Did I have a series about Persia? If you mean ancient Persia, I haven't discussed really ancient Persia, but if you look at episodes 21 and 22, 21 being the Safavid Empire and 22 being the first in my Armenia series, both of those cover a lot of Persian history. And also some of the earlier lectures, like for example, the Abbasids and Persianization, I think that's lecture number 6. That also discusses the Iranian intermezzo. And so
also, Richard, let me interject. Richard had done some of the presentation, if you go to ancient Persia, where we did, I think you did.
Oh, yeah. Marathon
Xerxes,
and Thermopylae,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, he did Xerxes, where the Battle of Thermopylae, from the Persian standpoint, obviously, which is definitely an interesting aspect. We only know from the Western part, Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, but there's a lot of that stuff from the Persian, as much as we have, I guess.
Yes. No, the thing is
Herodotus.
the Persians did write a lot about this. But you have to realize that from the Persian perspective, the Greeks were a bunch of terrorists, right? Like they thought about the Greeks the same way we think about Afghanistan. It's just this remote area where the people are barbaric and they're just causing problems. They're bombing cities on the Ionian coastline, and they need to quit it. And if they won't quit it, we'll make them quit it. So I have a question of which number is it on the YouTube channel? The ancient, I don't know which number it is. No, if you go to the YouTube playlist for the Middle Eastern and North African history series, the numbers that I give are accurate. So episode 20 is Safavids. Sorry, episode 21 is Safavids. Episode 22 is early Armenians. Episode 6 is Abbasids and Persianization. There is episode 13, which is about the Greater Seljuk Empire, which is primarily focused in what's now Iran. Episode 14 is about the Mongol attack on Iran primarily, but also other areas. And so all those are Iranian history, but I never did like one day of like beginning to end Iranian history.
Rich, I have a question. Great job, by the way. With respect to the European countries that are predominantly Muslim, would you say there's just a few, like example with Albania and Montenegro and one other I can't think of?
Montenegro is majority Orthodox. Bosnia is either majority or plurality Muslim. It depends how you count the Bosnian population and what census you're using. Albania is majority Muslim if you count the Sunnis and Bektashi together, because Bektashi is a Sufi Shiite order. So some people count them separately, in which case there's no religion in Albania that is more than 30%. If you count them together, then Muslims are a majority. If you Turkey obviously is a majority Muslim.
That's not Europe. That's like I'm talking about.
Well, Turkey, 10% of Turkish population and 5% of Turkish land is in Europe. So and the same, and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan are technically in Europe. I don't.
What about Croatia?
Croatia is Catholic.
Okay.
And
Serbia?
Serbia is Orthodox.
Okay. So what I don't know why I'm thinking of another country that was predominantly Muslim. Oh no. it's Albania for the most part, if you count the.
Yeah, Albania, if you count the Sunnis and Bektashi together.
Bosnia also.
Well, and Kosovo, if you count it as
Oh,
a
Kosovo,
that's what I
yes,
was thinking
Kosovo.
That's what I was
But,
thinking. Kosovo.
Bosnia as well, I guess.
Somebody's adding Bulgaria. Bulgaria is
No,
about
no,
14% Muslim.
Bosnia.
Only 14 though.
Yeah, we already
Uh,
mentioned Bosnia. Richard did.
Okay.
Yeah. No, Bosnia, like the number floats between 45% and 55%, depending on how you count the population of Bosnia.
And this
Yeah, and
is
also
the
the degree of adherence is very much almost like American Jews, right? I mean, there's obviously like a very hardcore, more Orthodox or more kind of committed, and then there's just a big sort of almost like cultural Muslims, which that are really Bosnians, really.
Yeah,
They call
exactly.
it
In Bosnia, the movement's called Muwahidun, or
That's right.
Unitarians.
Yep. And they're almost all sort of, post-Tito, so kind of like basically like Swedish democratic socialist kind of.
So, one of the other things is that in the Yugoslav system, you had this lowercase Muslim word that was often and uppercase Muslim word that was used to denote one for the religion and one for the nationality. The nationality has now become Bosniak with a K, or Bosniac in Serbo-Croatian. But this term of Bosniak doesn't just apply to Muslims in Bosnia. It applies to Muslims in Croatia. It applies to Muslims in Serbia, and it applies to Muslims in Montenegro to the extent that those Muslims are Serbo-Croatian speakers, right? There are other Muslim minorities in the Balkans still today.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, we'll let Richard go. Richard probably wants to get some dinner, but it's an amazing presentation. And today, we had over at a peak 40 people or so, and we usually have about 50, 60 people. But please do tell others to join our channel, to come back also to listen to next week, Russo-Turkish War. And, again, keep up a great job, Richard. I mean, I can't, thank you enough. It's amazing.
Richard,
Yes.
do you do anything on Afghanistan?
I have some ideas for a couple of lectures I might want to give sometime in the future. And it would be part of this series, but it would be Afghanistan in the 20th century. So we have to get to the 20th century first.
Yeah, if you want to blow your mind, Richard is very versatile. So his previous lecture was on Hyksos, which were the foreign rules of the pharaohs, ancient Egypt. So if you do want to see, the other side of Richard, he does other presentations, and it was just amazing. Nothing short, but of amazing, because he did talk about alphabet. It was interesting, really interesting. So do join our YouTube channel. You'll get notifications every time the new presentation comes in. If you happen to miss it, you can always catch it on the recording.
Thank you. Well,
all right. I guess we'll end it here, and have a nice evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Great
Nice to
job,
see everybody.
awesome job.
Thanks, Aaron.